This last section talks about the necessary life functions and homeostasis. So in order for an organism to be considered living, it has to do something, and we have these very specific qualifications for what we consider alive versus dead. These qualifications allow us to classify viruses as non-living organisms. So they're active or inactive, they're not alive or dead. You can't kill a virus. We'll learn more about that in microbiology, but these kind of qualify what life is. So I'm just going to go through these and give brief definitions for these. So responsiveness is talking about an organism's ability to respond to its environment. It senses things in the environment and changes in response to those, the things that it's sensed. Conductivity is talking about conducting electricity. Believe it or not, every living organism conducts electricity. All electricity is the movement of ions, or oppositely charged particles, atoms, from one side of the membrane to the other. So all life has the capability of conductivity. Anytime you have a nerve impulse or a muscle contraction, that's conductivity. Growth is an increase in cell size or cell number. Respiration is an exchange of gases. Digestion is talking about breaking down food products into their building blocks. Absorption is talking about the movement of those nutrients to an internal environment. So for a person, absorption would be moving the nutrients from the GI lumen into the bloodstream. Secretion is talking about the movement of fluid into an internal cavity, like you can secrete digestive enzymes into your stomach. Excretion is talking about the elimination of waste from the body. So you would excrete wastes out of the body, like you excrete urine, sweat, feces. Circulation is talking about the movement of substances around an organism or around internally. And reproduction is the ability to make offspring or produce offspring. So homeostasis kind of has to do with responsiveness, that major characteristic of life. Homeostasis is an overall well-being of the body. Stasis means to stand still. So when the body is in homeostasis, everything is functioning properly, everything has its checks and balances, and all is going well with the body. But in order for an organism to maintain homeostasis, it has to be able to respond to its environment, because things in the environment change and the organism needs to be able to adapt to those changes. So in a typical homeostatic kind of response system, we have a stimulus. So if I give you the example of stubbing your toe, the stimulus would be your foot hitting the wall. Receptor. Well, something has to sense the change. So the pain receptors in your foot would sense that your foot has just run into a wall. Input. So we have the afferent pathway going to the control center. This is talking about the sensory neurons and the sensory nerves that go from the toe to your central nervous system, your spinal cord. The control center is the central nervous system, so that's your brain or spinal cord, depending on where the stimulus came from and what the receptors were that picked up on that stimulus. Output, so the efferent pathway, this is your motor neurons that are going to take the directions from the central nervous system to the effector in order to produce a response. So you have motor neurons that are going to tell you to jerk your foot away from the source of the pain. Your response is your foot moving backwards. So in this, you would move your foot away from the source of the pain. There's negative feedback and positive feedback mechanisms that are associated with maintaining homeostasis. First, we're going to go through negative feedback. Negative feedback is where the response shuts off or decreases the original stimulus. So in negative feedback, a good example that they're giving here is temperature, body temperature. So if your body temperature increases, that change in temperature is sensed by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus regulates your body temperature. So if you have an increase in body temperature, your hypothalamus is going to want to try to make you cool off to get back down to that set point. And we have a very specific set point. We like our bodies at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. So when we get too hot, our body is going to stimulate our sweat glands to start sweating. Now if we're cold, our body's going to sense that we're cold, so that gets sensed by the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is going to produce these responses in order to cause us to shiver. And it's going to reroute blood flow to internal parts so that we can keep our blood warm and so forth. So in negative feedback, we're correcting the stimulus, and our response is kind of shutting off the initial stimulus. Similar thing happens in your house with the thermostat. If it's really cold outside and it's warm in your house, you set the thermostat in your house to a particular temperature. Now if it's set to 70 degrees in your house and the temperature drops down to 68, that's going to trigger the heat to turn back on, and it's going to heat up the house back to 70, and then it'll shut off the system. That's negative feedback. The response stops or reduces the initial stimulus. In positive feedback, the response exaggerates the original stimulus. So something's going to build and build and build and build until some big event happens, and then it just stops. The example they give here is broken blood vessel. So if you got blood leaking out of a blood vessel, just cut a blood vessel open, what's going to happen is platelets are going to start adhering to the blood vessel wall. And when the platelets stick, they're going to call more platelets to the area by secreting out chemicals. And then those platelets are going to stick, which cause the release of more chemicals and more platelets and more chemicals and more platelets. And it's going to build and build and build and build until finally you have the platelet plug formed. Then this system is done. So the chemical signals are going to stop, and you're not going to be bleeding out of your blood vessel anymore. Another example is pregnancy. So when a woman goes into labor, what's going to happen is the baby starts pushing down on the cervix, and that sends a signal to the brain to release the hormone oxytocin to cause a uterine contraction. And that uterine contraction, the uterus is going to contract and push the baby's head back down onto the cervix, and that's going to send another signal to the brain to release oxytocin. And this is going to build and build and build and build until the baby's delivered. And then it repeats itself all over again to deliver the placenta. But in positive feedback, it keeps building and building and building and adding on, and the previous action kind of, or the action kind of builds on the previous action until some big event happens, and then that's how you have positive feedback. Positive feedback is the most likely to end up in what we call homeostatic imbalances. So homeostatic imbalance is when you have a disruption in homeostasis. Something's not functioning properly and you fail to correct it. Homeostatic imbalances have the ability to cause disease. Let's say that a person had a really bad diet their entire life. Now with this bad diet, they started having an increase in LDL, which carried cholesterol to be packed into your tissues. So now they got cholesterol piling up inside of their blood vessels, and their blood vessels having that plaque in there that's known as atherosclerosis. And that's narrowing the blood vessels. And if this happens on the surface of the heart, where those blood vessels are needed in order to feed the heart muscle tissue, it's going to narrow and narrow and narrow. Eventually, it's going to starve your heart muscle tissue of all of the nutrients that it needs in order to keep beating. A portion of the heart could die from that, and that's what's known as a heart attack. So all because someone was consuming these fats in their diet, and it built and built and built, and eventually led to a disease state. So positive feedback mechanisms can lead to homeostatic imbalances, and homeostatic imbalances can lead to the development of disease. With a homeostatic imbalance, it has to be corrected medically, because the body is no longer able to correct itself. Those negative feedback mechanisms aren't enough to stop this, so medical intervention is necessary.